Lovely. So yeah, thanks, Sean. I'm Joe Whittaker. My research interests are framed around online radicalization mostly. In fact, if you've come to either of the first two TASMs, you probably heard me drone on about the greatest hits of online radicalization. Terrorists that use the internet are significantly more likely to also operate offline. You shouldn't think about these things on a spectrum. And even when I got quite deep into my PhD madness, I tried to claim that there wasn't really even a state of being online. But I'm not going to do any of that today. Don't worry. But I'm going to use the same data set that I compiled for my PhD, which was I created a database of about 231 ISIS terrorists within the United States. And I analyzed the online behaviors, compared them to the offline behaviors, and that was my PhD. But when looking through that line by line, I realized that because a lot of it came from court documents, there was some really, really in-depth financial information there. And I thought it would make a really kind of interesting research study. So, just to give a little brief overview. So, the literature on counter-terror finance is quite interesting. It kind of really exploded after 9/11, as you would probably imagine. There's quite a lot on the kind of regulatory side of things. And for the most part, where it exists within the kind of terrorist behaviors side of things, really starts to ask questions like, where does the money come from and what is it used for? And this is very heavily focused on what we'd think of as formal groups. So Al-Qaeda, ISIS, how that flow of money is coming in, what the formal group structures are using it for. And that's very interesting and it's very useful. But it's not the kind of thing that I like to study. I'm very interested in behaviors. And there is a small but growing literature which starts to look at individual terrorist behaviors and the different kinds of finance that they have started to use as well. These tend to be more generalized rather than thinking about online technologies. But just in general asking questions like how are individuals sourcing their plots, how are they paying for it, things like that. So to be kind of simplistic, the bottom line of most of this existing research is that terrorists are not being hugely complex when it comes to financial technologies. They tend to be opting for simpler ways of moving money and financing their plots. The one thing that I found quite interesting is that there's very, very little systemic research on the ways in which individual terrorists are purchasing things that are related to their plots. And that's something I'm trying to deal with here. There's a few kind of anecdotal reports and things like that. The US Treasury puts out reports, the Financial Action Task Force, and they include individual case studies, but there's very little systemic which actually tries to look at it in quite a kind of a longer, balanced manner. So, this general project, as I explained, is built up of about 231 ISIS actors. It's all created from open sources. So you can see from the background there, the really amazing starting point was the George Washington Program on Extremism and their ISIS cases repository. If you ever want a really deep dive on anything, I think there's over 20,000 pages of the court documents relating to ISIS actors. So an absolute treasure trove of court documents there. Now, where I'm trying to be quite novel with this is, rather than looking just at terrorist behaviors, like most of the studies that exist so far, is that I wanted to look at the individual transaction level. And I believe this is actually the first piece of research which does that. So rather than saying, this terrorist did this, spent this much money, I'm trying to break it down to the individual transactions so I can be slightly more rigorous and in-depth. There's three research questions, and I've kind of hinted at them already for the most part. So the first is, what kind of technology are terrorists using to move money around? Understandably, there's kind of concerns about cryptocurrencies as well as other kinds of financial technology, be it PayPal or gift cards and things like that. But again, not very much systemic level evidence to actually see if that's the case. The second is, what kind of technology are terrorists using to make purchases in pursuit of their plots? So I've tried to make an assessment on what kind of purchases were essential to plots. I'll get into a bit more detail of that later on. And then seeing how terrorists are doing it. Are they using cards? Again, are they using it online? Are they doing it in the online or offline domain? And then finally, I think the underlying question of all of this is, does it matter? So does the kind of technology that terrorists are using affect their chances of success? The kind of logic, at least, is that cryptocurrencies and things like that do present a particular vulnerability because if they're used well, they are a lot more difficult to trace than other kinds of financial tech. So I'll start off with just a little bit of kind of demographic and event data. I think I've left off a decent amount, but I think this is kind of relevant when we're talking about adoption of tech. For the first part, it's a relatively young cohort. So the median age was 26. It does span from 15 to about 55, I think. But in general, this is pretty young people. So if there was some kind of technological exploitation, you'd probably be expecting it to find it in groups like this. That being said, most of these kind of database studies have a similar kind of age. It's quite typical for terrorist databases. As a group, they tend to err on the lower side of the socioeconomic spectrum, although that's kind of a general point. There are rich people, there are poorer people, but there's about 40% of them didn't have a job. It's important to note that that's not the same as being unemployed, because unemployment is people that are actively seeking a job but don't have it. And then about a third of them were in the kind of service or low-skilled sector. And then in terms of education, about two-thirds of them, their high school education was the highest point they had. So again, it does go all the way up to postgraduate level as well, but erring towards the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. In terms of their role in the plot, because this is kind of ISIS in America, about half of them were trying to, or successfully were traveling to Iraq or Syria, then about a third were attempting to attack, and then fewer numbers either financing plots or providing some kind of non-financial facilitation, and a relatively small amount were making bombs. The eagle-eyed of you will probably notice that adds up to more than 100% because some of them had multiple roles in a job. And about 4 in 10 of them I deemed to be successful in their plots. I know that can be a bit squidgy in times. It did come out with some relatively good intercoder reliability, but ultimately, if you're a traveller, it's whether you made it to the caliphate. If you're an attacker, it's whether the attack went off, regardless of fatalities. And whether you were facilitating, it was related to the plot that you were facilitating. And as you can see from the pie chart on the left, the majority of people were in groups of larger than 2. So there was a decent chunk of lone actors and solo actors being people that executed the plot on their own, but were part of had sort of command and control links. But as you can see, small cells is probably the best way to describe how most of these individuals were operating. If you want any more of the kind of general information about the online behaviours, this is an article at the bottom which kind of goes into a little bit more detail about the online behaviours and includes the demographic information. So, first research question, how were they moving money? So there was about 226 transactions in total, which came to about just under $500,000. With a mean monetary transaction of about 2,000 and a median of 1K. In terms of where the money came from, about half of them were self-financing, which is quite a lot, I think. Again, quite a lot of concern about all the money coming from the Islamic State, and they were sending money back to individuals to conduct plots. That happened relatively small amount at the time. Mostly, for the most part, is that a lot of these plots were not hugely complicated, so they didn't require a lot of external funding. And then co-ideologues, about 20% at the time, or individuals finding some sort of credit, either via credit cards or loans. And perhaps I'm burying the lead slightly here, but about 10% of the plots came from the FBI setting up some kind of undercover operation and sting, something that the FBI does quite a lot here. One of the things I think is quite interesting, in fact, I'll come back to that in a sec, actually. So looking at kind of the main research question of what kind of technology was being used to move, what we can see is terrorists are really opting for cash here. Despite all of these concerns about virtual currencies or even cryptocurrencies, that cash is still king when it comes to this particular cohort. And behind that, about a third of the transactions were money service businesses, so think Western Unions and MoneyGrams and things like that. So looking at this really, I think, tells you that terrorists are not taking advantage of those potential vulnerabilities, that instead they are generally going with what they know. However, a third of these movements were coordinated on the internet, which I think is quite interesting. So even if they are going for these old school methods of moving money, handing cash to each other or using money service businesses, they are still using social media, they are still emailing each other, they're still using messaging platforms to talk about how they're going to move the money and to talk about the best operational ways to do so. So it does show that the internet does play quite an important role even if they're not logging into PayPal or logging into Skrill or Monero or whatever. In terms of the second research question, what kind of technology purchases are being used to make, there was about 319 purchases, although there was only 70 in which the total amount was identifiable, so slightly fewer, which came to just less than 100 grand, and again, a mean purchase of about 1,300 and a median of about 600. In terms of what they were being used for, about a quarter of them were tickets to usually Istanbul to then go to Iraq or Syria, and about 15% kind of plot-related issues, so firearms, then 12% for bomb-making materials, 12% other attack materials, that was often knives, sometimes even renting cars for vehicle-borne attacks and things like that. And then military clothing. So for the most part, it's travel tickets being the most popular, and then things that are some way related to an attack. And then there's a kind of a chunky other, which is, for the most part, things like passport renewals and things like that. Now, this one was relatively split between the online and offline, almost 50-50. We can see from the table on the left, about 42% of all transactions were done in kind of offline, what I've called offline traders. So, Walmarts or other type stores where you can go and, or perhaps gun stores or things like that, where you can literally go and buy the materials themselves. But hot on its heels is your online traders, your eBays, your Amazons. So, good examples of an individual who ordered 3 knives from Amazon in a plot that started with an attempt to murder Pamela Geller, but ended up with a plot to try and murder police officers instead. And then a number of individuals bought things from the US government. Again, that's mostly passport renewals and green cards and things like that. And again, we can see a not insignificant number of plots that are basically, again, the seller is the FBI, and again, think undercover stings and things like that as well. And what we can see is, again, unlike the previous research question, that cash is not necessarily as prevalent here, that it's more debit cards and credit cards that are being used very predominantly. And then we can start to see some kind of fintech being used for purchases. And again, there were some things that were bought via PayPal and such. Okay, so finally, does it actually matter? The short answer is probably not really, to be honest. So I was interested in whether... Hope you all look forward to reading the article. Yeah. So yeah, as I mentioned, there's a huge literature which talks about the vulnerabilities that are coming out from this kind of tech. There's 4 or 5 articles that are in the top peer-reviewed journals that say, here are all the ways in which cryptocurrency could be really bad. Here are all the ways in which other virtual currencies might be particularly problematic. And logically, they seem to make some kind of a sense. But I, trying to look at it empirically. So the first thing I did was I ran chi-squared analyses against all the different ways in which people moved money, against whether the plot was successful. And the only one which showed any kind of significant correlation was using money service businesses. So not the virtual currencies, not the cryptocurrencies, although there's obviously sample size issues with that. But it made them 2.9 times more likely to be successful. So then the next question was, if you run it as a regression, perhaps controlling for the amount of money that was transferred, does it remain significant? To which the answer is yes. So ultimately, all it's really saying is that you're probably more likely to be successful than not if you use one of these money service businesses. Not necessarily with cash, no significant correlates, not with cryptocurrencies, not with virtual currencies or anything like that. So I think for the most part, that really shows that a lot of this talk about these particular vulnerabilities may miss the mark to some extent. So I guess I'll just finish up by trying to defrag slightly what this might mean. So I think the first thing to note is that, much like the existing literature, this cohort does demonstrate that terrorists tend to opt for simplicity. So despite there being some quite high-profile cases of individuals like Zubir Shanaz transferring a lot of money via Bitcoin and things like that, they tend to reach the front pages of the press and things like that. But when you look at a larger cohort, it doesn't necessarily demonstrate that that is being done on a widespread level. And that there's little appetite for kind of complex, thanks Sean, cheers. There's little appetite for complex financial technologies. One of the things I think was particularly interesting is that terrorists are not only using simple type ways to move and purchase money, but they tend to stick with one individual one. So there's only, I think, one case where an individual is using 3 or 4 different types of ways to move money. And for the most part, people are just either using cash and sticking with it, or they're using a money service business and sticking with it. But again, they're tending to just kind of go with what they know. The third is that, yeah, tech is still being used, but in much more of a facilitative role. So rather than being used to kind of make the purchase, it's just being used to help coordinate and help to perhaps offer operational advice. And then purchasing, as I mentioned, has started to move online. So perhaps the last question that I just want to think about slightly is whether we should be expecting this to change in the future. And I think that kind of ties in quite nicely with the kind of framework that Yannick was laying out before. Whether we might expect some of these vulnerabilities to become more present. So on the one hand, I think a lot of the kind of the reasoning that a lot of these scholars are using for the vulnerabilities do seem to make sense. If used properly, cryptocurrency could provide some kind of high degree of vulnerability, and if that is the case, and it's getting more and more difficult to move money, then you might expect some kind of innovation there if, for whatever reason, the benefits start outweighing the costs. And then we can also say, but I think perhaps on the other hand, I'm not necessarily sure I quite buy that argument. So, well, sorry, let me go back slightly. Just I think actually we are now at a stage. Sorry, when we start to look at far-right extremists, so when we look at Jan 6th and such things, we can start to see some individuals that were facilitating money using cryptocurrencies, using some kind of advanced technology as well. So it might be that there is some kind of intergroup learning between them as well. That being said, I'm not necessarily quite so sure that the barriers to entry are all that high right now. It is actually not very difficult to start using Tor and then start using things like Monero and be pretty much completely untraceable at that time. So then the question really is about incentives and disincentives and what is being put out there. And this is where I think, as I mentioned, there's a really interesting disincentive that clearly, perhaps the old adage of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is what the terrorists are currently following. That, as the third research question demonstrates, terrorists were quite likely to be successful if they were using their own tried and tested methods. So there is currently very little incentive for them to be moving on to these kind of more advanced technologies. So that, I think, is about me. So thank you very much.